So, welcome everyone. This is another episode of the Buddhist Medicine and Yoga Therapy or Yoga podcast. And I have with me Professor Pierce Salguero. Thank you for joining us again.
Yeah, thanks for having me back on. I feel like we could talk for days and days and days. So you know, I'm happy to be here as many times as you invite me.
Yes, I'm anticipating another episode. And today I'd like to zero in on the second of a number of publications. It was on, or I just wanted to highlight Buddhism and medicine, modern and contemporary sources. And perhaps this could be the subject of a follow up. Today's topic is Buddhism and contemporary healing. And there are a number of articles you forward. They'll be in the resources area of our website and online. But I want to talk about the landscape of Buddhist healing
Yeah.
in North America. So there were three projects, Pierce, that you wrote on. One of them was Buddhism and Healing. There was an online survey. The second was a discussion of the Jivaka project, and then a pre-publication article on Buddhism and medicine in America, which I'm really excited to get to. So if it's okay, why don't we jump in and explore this online survey? Can you tell us a little bit about its objectives and how you went about contacting Buddhist practitioner demographics?
Yeah. Happy to. So the online survey was something that happened. I think I'm gonna forget now. I think it started in 2014, and was open. Maybe it started in 2015, and it was open for many years. I was gathering people's responses, and we finally did the last round of data collection during the COVID pandemic, so later in 2020, I believe. I wrote up the results of the study and published them in 2022 in the journal called Pacific World, under the title Beyond Mindfulness, Buddhism and Health in the U.S. And kind of the title is the argument of the piece, which is to say that there's been so much attention paid to mindfulness in the U.S., in the public media, in the popular media, and this has, I mean, rightfully so, because there's some really exciting results that are coming out of the scientific community, whether it's neuroscience or medical research or psychological research. There's a lot of really great benefits for the practice of mindfulness. And so that tends to be the piece of Buddhist health advice that gets all the press, at the expense of all the other things that Buddhism has to offer in terms of health and well-being. And so, as a historian who's looked at sort of like the global history of Buddhist interventions, healthcare interventions over the long term, I was also very curious about to what extent the wider range of Buddhist practices was being embraced in the United States. And I had done some ethnography in Philadelphia among Buddhist temples here, that I think that's the second piece that you wanted to talk about. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But that research project had already begun. And so I knew that there was significant Asian American communities that were doing all kinds of practices related to health, but I was curious about sort of like the wider demographic. And so I created a survey, online survey, and distributed it widely through social media platforms that I'm affiliated with or that I was aware of. And so it's kind of, it's not a statistical sample of, it's not a representative sample of American Buddhism. It is, a broad survey that captures a very wide range of demographics, but it was sort of like through my social media and social networks that the respondents were found. So we eventually wound up with around I'm going to forget the numbers, but 300 some odd respondents from across a wide range of different racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, geographic locations in the U.S. All of them were identifying as Buddhist, and they responded to a number of questions about their views about health and the connections between Buddhism and health. And I guess the overwhelming conclusion from the study, the big takeaway point is that Buddhists are looking to Buddhism for healthcare resources more broadly, far beyond just mindfulness, but a whole range of different practices, different kinds of teachings, and also the social component was very prominent too. The way that Buddhist um, organizations give people a social community and a setting in which they feel like their healthcare needs are being met. Also, yeah. So just sort of like um, a snapshot of a wide swath of American Buddhists, really kind of like emphasizing how centrally the health how central of a role health is playing in their practice of Buddhism.
So if we can go ahead, I wanted to share one document or table. And that's one thing that struck me. It wasn't necessarily a representative sample, but it did give us a sense of a picture in terms of aspects of Buddhist practice in different cultural settings and with different demographics, what they found specifically useful or related to health and health care. So, is from this table, is there anything you can share in terms of appraisals, attitudes towards Buddhist views of the body or health or sickness that were specifically relevant to Buddhist practitioners that you surveyed? And what were the types of practices that were really important to health and well-being?
Yeah. So this is table two from the article, and I think those first two questions are kind of like the headline questions. Do you think that your tradition of Buddhism has a connection with mental health? What particular practices? And then do you think your tradition of Buddhism has connection with physical health and what particular practices? So you can see in the table that 59%, well, say strong or very strong connection between Buddhism and mental health. Actually, if you add that with the next line, 89% of Buddhists think that there's some kind of mental health benefit. And in the third question, that there is, what is that, 76 percent of Buddhists say that their tradition of Buddhism has a strong connection with physical health. So that's an overwhelming majority of Buddhists feel that health is a part of Buddhism or is closely connected with Buddhism. Um, when you look at the actual practices, it's not surprising to see meditation at the top of the list of practices that people are talking about. In separately elsewhere in the survey, we broke that out and realized that people weren't just talking about mindfulness; they were talking about a whole range of different meditations, from from mindfulness, vipassana, visualization, Zen, Zazen, all sorts of different practices. And then so beyond meditation, you have other kind of like leading factors, social gatherings, like I mentioned earlier. Half of Buddhists say that was relevant to their mental health. Chanting was another big one. And visualizations kind of broken out as a separate category, vegetarianism is a separate category. And then, attending, the way the question reads, it's attending specific healing rituals, classes, and activities. And there we were kind of trying to capture how many Buddhist communities actually have courses or have, specific trainings that relate to health and medicine as well. So yeah, so you can see it's a really wide range of things that people were identifying as being relevant to their health, beyond just mindfulness.
if we can tie in this other article, Varieties of Buddhist Healing in Multi-Ethnic Philadelphia, I noticed some observations for myself as a healthcare practitioner or an educator, as well as a Buddhist practitioner. So, one, there were many different types of Buddhist practice traditions. Vajrayana Buddhism is perhaps more of a home for me, Zen practice, and also different forms of Chinese or South Asian Buddhism. Can you tell us a little bit about this study or this research?
Yeah, so this, sorry, just yeah, get rid of the notifications. Okay. Yeah. So this study was actually it started before the previous study that we talked about. The publication came out a little bit before in 2019. And this study is the name of the journal article is The Varieties of Buddhist Healing in Multi-Ethnic Philadelphia. And it is a report from the Jivaka project. So that's JIVAKA.net. It was an online project that I had my students doing, where my students were going around to temples in Philadelphia, taking photos, doing interviews, and eventually we made some documentary films as well with my collaborator Lan Lee, who is collaborates with me on my podcast now, Blue Barrel. So we uh, were gathering this data for the website as sort of like an interactive educational pedagogical um, project with my students. And as the data was coming in, it became more and more interesting to me and more important that this data was actually revealing something important about the relationship between Buddhist institutions and healthcare more generally in this American city. So I should say the students that were doing the studies. So my college, Abington College, is a very diverse campus with many students from the Philadelphia area. We're actually an Asian American Pacific Islander serving institution, which means that the percentage of our students that are Asian is much higher than the norm across the U.S. And so I had, I was teaching these courses on Buddhism and Asian medicine and so forth. And so I had in my classes the privilege of having students who were from Asian American communities in Philadelphia, many of whom spoke Asian languages, and whose family members or even themselves were members of these temples in the area. So there was a lot of access that my students were able to have in these temples. When they went around and started interviewing, we were getting a lot of really interesting responses, very detailed responses from the communities. And it allowed us to, so our interviews were focused on the relationship between Buddhism and healthcare. And what started to become apparent from the data, one was just really the sort of the range, the repertoire of healing practices that was being sort of practiced across all of these different institutions around Philadelphia, and just really the wide range of different ways that the temples were involved in healthcare. And then, because it was a multi-ethnic study, multicultural study, where we were looking at all these different varieties of Buddhism, all these different kinds of different communities across the Philadelphia area, we were able to sort of like look for patterns or look for differences between those communities' engagement in healthcare. And I was kind of looking at, me as somebody who was, familiar with the scholarship on American Buddhism. I was looking for these strong divides that were supposed to be characteristic of the American Buddhist landscape, right? The American Buddhist landscape was supposed to, according to the scholarship, have these strong divides between convert Buddhists and what they call heritage Buddhists, right? So people who were, born and raised in a culture where Buddhism is practiced, versus people who were converting, who didn't have that background. and how split these two communities are in terms of their gatherings, which is true. You do have white sanghas, Lao sanghas, Thai sanghas, Chinese sanghas, Black and Latino sanghas, right? And they do tend to be split in those ways. And of course, they also have their sectarian affiliations. So you have Mahayana sanghas, and you have Theravada sanghas, and you have Vajrayana sanghas, and so forth. Um, so while the landscape is divided in that way, when we were specifically looking at healthcare as the thing we were looking at, it actually split out radically differently. So it was sort of like pushing back against the kind of the divisions that scholars have made about American Buddhism, when we started looking at the factors related to health and medicine, and there it started to become more apparent that there were other factors at play that were a lot more influential about shaping how these sanghas were involved in medicine, beyond race, ethnicity, and sectarianism. Um, so some of those factors, included socioeconomics of the neighborhood. They included, demographic factors of the neighborhoods in which these temples were located. And they also included, access to social media resources and connections with the home country. So there was a number of different factors that I lay out in the article, that seem to be much more important to the communities than, like I said, than race, ethnicity, and sectarian affiliation. So yeah, so it's kind of like, and then I give a couple case studies in the article too, just to sort of paint a richer picture of the ethnographic field. So the article is trying to do two things. One, it's just sort of like give, a detailed picture of what Buddhist healthcare looks like in Philadelphia, and then also to make this broader point that, about what factors seem to be the most relevant in influencing what people do. And just, I guess, like kind of maybe a takeaway point, to mention is that, it really appears that in many cases, Buddhist temples are serving to fill gaps in the healthcare system. Particularly, this is particularly true for immigrant and refugee communities, where the Buddhist temples are really facilitating access to healthcare, for these populations that, that and feel it, both gaining access to mainstream biomedical and public health infrastructure, but also filling gaps with traditional medicine, with other kinds of practices, with kind of facilitating word of mouth and other kinds of information exchanges among the temple goers, related to health and healing, traditional foods and other kinds of cultural practices, and just really sort of, yeah, the article is really trying to highlight how important the Buddhist temples are in the modern American healthcare landscape, which I think is a completely glossed over point that, I haven't heard, anybody talking about really. Again, there's mindfulness, right? But this is sort of like looking beyond mindfulness at a much broader range of social and cultural healing practices.
So these temples and Buddhist institutions, they do serve a role, just like they do in Asian cultural settings. But that's what really struck to me. It really spoke to my own lived experience reading these two articles. One about immigrant and refugee communities in Asian sanghas, and then as myself identifying as an Asian American and kind of straddling this divide of convert Buddhism and a really a different experience I have in certain retreat settings where the demographic is primarily Asian versus more mixed population. And so one thing that you highlighted is that in this convert Buddhism, this is an academic category, there is a large emphasis on meditation. The studies are quite extensive. You actually mentioned the value of literature review and ethnographic studies. So one of the things that I got from the paper you were just speaking to is when we look at Buddhism's interaction and influence on health in the US, in Asian sanghas, we do emphasize what would be called religious and ritual aspects. But like you said, when I was growing up and I just met some uh, some other practitioners, Buddhist family, but in an immigrant family, we also joined the local Korean church. It was our way of connecting to resources and community. So that's the part of the social context of healing. And you mentioned the material culture of material facets or material culture of healing. And these are so prominent in Asian American religious contexts or Buddhist contexts, whereas in healthcare, we're looking at adoption or integration of mindfulness based or compassion focused care. And we have Stanford. So, do you see this as a clear divide in Buddhist healing in the US from the surveys you've done?
I mean, I guess like there's definitely a clear divide between the kinds of healing and healthcare that's taking place within temple communities and then within sort of like secular or like hospital clinics and so forth, right? So yeah, a lot of what you're talking about with the stripping out of the material culture, the stripping out of this sort of more more cultural supports and cultural attributes and aspects of healing, um, stripping out the Asian cultural aspects of healing and replacing those with kind of like a secularized, modern American cultural wrapper around the practice is certainly happening in the hospitals, and that is happening, much less so in most of these temple communities that we were looking at. Um, you know, all sorts of people from all kinds of backgrounds talk to us about the benefits of meditation as part of this ethnography. They frequently, almost always, referred to stress reduction, mindfulness, having the effect of stress reduction, having, they were often citing sort of scientific studies and literature to make that point. So there certainly was like kind of like an absorption on that side of the scientific materials. Um, but what's interesting is when we looked across all of the various different multicultural, multi-sectarian Buddhist communities, it was not the case that convert communities were more scientific or secular in the way that they talked about the benefits of Buddhism versus, the Asian American communities. It was not the case that Asian American communities focused more on, chanting, for example, and the white communities, focused more on meditation, for example. What we found is across the board, their repertoires of healing were shared really widely between the different communities, and that it was a lot more likely to be, the demographics of the neighborhood that were influential in determining or influencing what the temples were doing. So I'll just give you an example. The like the Lao temple in downtown Philadelphia is in a predominantly immigrant and predominantly Asian American immigrant community. And in that setting, that Lao temple partnered with the hospital in order to run kind of a healthcare clinic where nurses from the hospital would come and do, vaccinations and blood pressure readings and all sorts of other kinds of frontline preventative biomedical care, right? And if you contrast that with like the Korean temple in the suburbs that owns a acupuncture school where they teach a predominantly white student body how to practice acupuncture. Right, there's like sort of examples like that sort of cut across the stereotyping in really interesting ways. That were so were that was the norm, right? Rather than these temples sort of falling into an easy stereotype between converts and heritage Buddhists, what we found was just really a much richer kind of environment where all of these different factors were, social, demographic, location, networks, were a lot more relevant than the sectarian affiliation or the convert status. Is that making sense what I'm saying?
Absolutely, but so that's surprising. Let's make a case example of COVID, the time of COVID, which you had written a little bit about, and parsing this out a little bit more. There were some topics about how we address pain and suffering or understand illness. And there was some data about how it impacted our notion of caregiving or being more available. Is there anything that comes to mind in terms of those uh, categories?
Yeah, so that's back to the other study where we were doing the more sort of broad-based online interview survey of American Buddhists, and yeah, so that one I had not closed the study by the time that it had been a little bit since I had collected data, but I had not actually formally closed the study when the pandemic outbreak happened, and so I followed up with the some portion of the respondents had opted to leave their email addresses for in order to be contacted for follow-up. And so I followed up with those people and asked them, some follow-up questions related to COVID. And of that portion, a small percentage responded to the COVID question. So, whereas we had, close like 300 or so respondents to the survey on the whole, the actual COVID questions were far fewer respondents. But from the respondents that we did hear from, um, you know, it it appears to me, I mean, so I talk about this in the article, sort of in the last section of the article, talk about the COVID responses. And one of the points I make there is it does appear that Buddhism was playing a role in sort of what I would call pro-social behavior in the pandemic. So people who were Buddhists seem to be expressing at the time that we did the survey. I don't know how this would have happened later because this was early on in the pandemic, prior to the vaccines. The respondents were using Buddhist ideas like interdependence and compassion to articulate why they were involved in pro-social behavior like mask wearing and social distancing and so forth. So it seemed to me anyway that their Buddhist commitments were positively influencing their health related behavior um, that segment of the population. Um, and a lot of them told stories. They got more kind of like verbose in this part of the survey because there were a lot of open-ended questions instead of just sort of yes/no questions, or multiple choice questions. And so they were talking about how their Buddhist communities were providing them with sort of like a meaningful with meaning in the time of the pandemic, that Buddhist ideas and Buddhist community and Buddhist communities and rituals and practices were sort of like helping them to navigate the stresses and the fear and other trials of the pandemic. So it certainly seemed like Buddhism was playing a positive role for those people.
From my observation, it was uh, almost a follow-up. I had a center for about 10 or 15 years, and part of that time in Brooklyn was hosting and preserving Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhist forms of healing. And so my observation was at the time online, a lot of the methods, these special Buddhist healing methods that I had been trying to learn and document were now all over the internet. And you'd find resources for certain types of visualization or mantra practices or rituals. Did you see any spotlight on the healing aspects of Buddhist practice more so during the time of the pandemic?
Yeah, but so our respondents were, like I said, it was kind of like a segment of the overall respondent pool. So, it may not be super representative, but the respondents didn't give us nearly as much kind of data about specific interventions, like what you're saying, as they did about sort of more, like I said, pro-social kind of behaviors. So yeah, and that actually could be quite interesting to look at. The one thing I'm thinking of just in terms of what you were just talking about is, just a reminder that this survey, when I wrote up I mean, we heard from, like I said, about 300 people, but when I wrote up the article, I controlled for just the people who identified as being Buddhist, right? So I think what you're talking about is like the popularization of Buddhist techniques, like widely beyond just the Buddhist community, but like, openly available on the internet, and who knows who is doing it, right? So we were just looking at people who identified as Buddhists in that follow-up COVID section.
So just to kind of, sorry to go back to this prior article, there's I'm looking at the consumer aspect of healthcare, medical pluralism in the US, and how Buddhism interfaces with that. In different communities, different regions, we have access to healthcare. And you had mentioned some of these aspects in open-ended responses: stress regulation, emotion regulation, how it impacts immunity. I just want to bring up diet, but for both the provider and those consumers seeking healthcare, can you speak a little bit, one, about hybridity in uh, Buddhist healthcare practice, what that might mean, hybridity?
Yeah, so that's actually a pretty interesting area of research for me. That's sort of like, I think, the angle that got me really into the sort of analysis or the study of American Buddhism, because if you remember from our previous conversations, my doctoral research, my books, the main line of my research has to do with the introduction of Buddhist healing practices to China from India, and sort of like the translation of those practices into a new culture, and then also tracking sort of more globally in my most recent book, the global history of Buddhist medicine, looking at how sort of Buddhism is both a transnationally, transregionally um, transmitted body of knowledge, but then also is always localized in each place, right? So there's always a process of hybridity or adaptation, or whatever word you want to use. There's always a cross-cultural sort of like um, digesting of the Buddhist tradition and applying it in the local context. And so I see, the story of American Buddhism exactly in that same larger picture. Except it's far more complicated, because this isn't the story of just one tradition of Buddhism being spread to the US. Rather, it's all traditions of Buddhism all arriving at the same time, right? So the last 100 years or so of the history has been the arrival not only of Buddhism, but of all sorts of different Asian spiritual and religious traditions all at the same time, and the kind of opportunity for hybridity, the opportunity for selection and adaptation, and cross-fertilization between all of those traditions is huge, right? So that's, yeah, it's an area of kind of like theoretical interest, right? It's an interesting sort of thing to think about, processes of cross-cultural exchange and translation and so forth. So in this particular survey, this particular survey, we had students, research team were tagging the responses from the respondents with thematic tags. So like identifying themes, broader themes in the responses. And so hybridity was kind of the tag that we used for people who were talking about mixing together different forms of spirituality, different forms of practice of medical or health practice. So if somebody mentioned, for example, mixing, yeah, I don't know, Buddhist, I don't know, whatever, Tonglen practice um, with Christian practice, let's say, that would have gone under hybridity. But if they talked about, mixing um, traditional herbal medicine with antibiotics, that would have gone under hybridity too, right? So there's sort of like a broad category there in this survey of, hybridity where where my interest with this kind of got a little more focused was in the third article, the one that we haven't talked about yet, which I feel like that is the place that I really analyze kind of like the hybrid nature of American Buddhism and healing, and really looking at sort of what does that mean and what are the various ways that hybridity plays out in this landscape. So I don't know if we're ready to pivot to that yet, but
No,
that is.
so let's go there. And that was also my notion in terms of I wanted you, what you did was to unpack this phrase transnational,
Mm,
pardon me. We talk about this a lot in modern yoga studies, but you use the word transnationally interconnected nature of Buddhist healing in the US today. And you also spoke about the diversity in local contexts. But hybridity, when I think about it, I think about medical pluralism. I think about healthcare consumerism. You have your choices and the way that you understand your illness or disease, and you address aspects as a consumer in healthcare, aspects of illness experience through different doctors, therapists, herbs. But
mm.
you're pivoting to research, independent research. That looked at Buddhist healers in the US. And as a clinician myself, I practice Chinese medicine, but I draw Ayurveda or Tibetan medicine. Is this what you're finding in your Buddhist healer uh, subjects?
Yeah. So yeah, let me go back to the transnational versus hybridity. So yeah, so I, as a scholar of cross-cultural exchange and translation of Buddhist medicine, what I always look at is like both sides of the coin. There's um the transnational, the pan-Asian Buddhist tradition, right? Like what's similar between Chinese Buddhism, Indian Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism, and when Buddhism moves to a new place, what are the elements that are brought from one place to the next, and adopted in that new culture. So we can think of American Buddhism. We can think of lots of aspects that are transnational. So back to the Philadelphia article, a lot of these temples in Philly are connected directly with, they're branch temples of temples located in Seoul and in, Bangkok and all over Asia. And so there's literally a transnational institutional context. There's also transnational movement of people, right? Monastics coming from Thailand to serve as monks in the temple outside of Philly, right? And members of that temple going to the mother temple in Bangkok and like back and forth, right? So and they'll bring herbal medicines back from Thailand when they come back, right? And share it with the community, or they'll, there's an actual like flow, transnational flow of people, ideas, institutions, and medical material culture as well, right? So that's like sort of, and it's not just happening with Thailand; it's happening with all of the Asian countries in this kind of like very fluid kind of exchange between Philadelphia and the rest of the Buddhist world. So you could look at Buddhism as like a node in the Buddhist world, right? And all the flows that come through Philadelphia from, or from other Buddhist countries. And that's sort of like looking with a transnational sort of like lens, right? But then you can change the lens and look at sort of like the not what's being adopted here, but how things are being adapted here, right? So the other side of the coin, which is the way that these practices, the way that these ideas, that these people, these cultural phenomena get absorbed in the U.S., and how they're transformed by local situations, by local expectations, by local interactions with different uh, groups than you would have back in Asia, right? By local laws, legal landscape here in the U.S. is different. By just a different media sphere, different kinds of discourses that are happening here in the U.S., right? And also by the kind of juxtaposition of these Buddhist practices with all sorts of other practices from all sorts of different kinds of Buddhism, but also different kinds of religions altogether that are all mixing together in a place like Philadelphia. And it just creates a whole different sort of like um, a whole different practice on the ground of Buddhist medicine, right? So I'm always, as you know, like I said, like a scholar of cross-cultural exchange and translation, I'm always looking at like the transnational context and the local context, both together, and how they're sort of like in a dynamic interplay with each other. Um, so that's what I meant earlier by transnational. Um,
Tell us a little bit about this research with Buddhist healers in North
yeah,
America.
yeah, thanks for getting me back on track. So this other article is, yeah, it hasn't come out yet. It's going to come out in the Oxford Handbook of American Buddhism. And this is a different survey that I did with a far smaller number of people, 36 respondents in this case. From again, it's through my own social contacts that I was able to um, talk to these people. Uh, and this is again but again, it's an attempt to be representative of sort of a wide swath of Buddhists. So there's racially, age, gender, immigration status, location across the US, the Buddhist sect, all of that is variable across the 36 different people. And in this case, rather than have an online survey, these were in-depth interviews up to 2 hours, talking with each one of these people about their practice, about what they do and how they do it, and what they think about the relationship between Buddhism and medicine. Um, so again, there was a little bit of like a keyword or thematic tagging that was done to the transcripts. In this case, we spat out, like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. I think it was 300,000 words um, of interview transcripts, and had some uh, textual analysis on the transcripts to find sort of like themes that came up. Um, so I don't know if you want to get like down into the nitty gritty of that kind of data, but the main point of this article was sort of like to take a step back and look at what I call the positionalities, the different positionalities that emerge from this group of respondents. So I'm all 36 of these people were they identify as being Buddhist involved with Buddhism and healthcare in some way. But when we talked to them about what that involvement meant and what that involvement looked like, it kind of broke out into these six different kind of positionalities, what I'm calling positionalities, and they all have something to do with hybridity. So um, the six different, maybe I'll just say what the six are, and then I'll stop there and see if you want to follow up. But the six different positionalities are, so we found a cluster of these Buddhist healers who were actively incorporating Buddhism into mainstream healthcare. So they work in a mainstream healthcare setting like a hospital or whatever, and they're actively integrating Buddhism into that context. Um, so the second positionality is people who are integrating Buddhism with traditional Asian medicine. So maybe somebody like yourself, you just described, an acupuncturist, but also like drawing on Buddhist rituals or Buddhist practices, right? So that was our second cluster of people. The third cluster of people were people who were Dharma teachers, so not working in biomedical or traditional medicine, but just Dharma teachers. But yet in their sanghas, they are integrating um, healthcare priorities into the way that they're teaching Buddhism. So I called that, optimizing Dharma teachings for health outcomes, right? So teaching Dharma, not necessarily all the time, but in in response to our questions, my questions about, Buddhism and health, they would talk about how in their sanghas they are teaching they're teaching their sanghas to uh, apply Buddhist teachings in order to optimize health. Um, yeah.
Yeah, so that I found really interesting because a lot of the Dharma teaching we do in with some institutions I'm involved with incorporate Tibetan medicine, which we call Sorikpa. And something that I thought was glaring, and I've personally tried to work to contribute in the landscape, is somatic or yogic practices. And I was wondering, I didn't see so much in the interview subjects of these uh, different studies mention of Buddhist yogas. There was some notion of health, but I think would that change the outlook on the notion of how Buddhism is practiced in a more secular society? This merger of health practices in Buddhist medicine and Buddhism, yogic practice, bodily
Yeah.
practice.
Yeah, so I'm in the Dharma teaching section. There was one Korean Buddhist practitioner who did talk about some movement-based therapies. I don't think they would have used the word yoga because it's coming out of more of an East Asian context. I should say all of these interviews were done in English. So, even if they spoke English as a second language. Oh, sorry, that's not true. That's not true. All except for one were done in English, because one of them I had a translator. But the person I'm thinking of was a Dharma practitioner who was doing something that maybe we would probably think of as closer to Tai Chi or Qigong, and they were calling it moving meditation or something like that. So yeah, but there were several people in the traditional medicine category that were coming out of a Tibetan. There was multiple, three, I think, if I'm memory serving properly, that came out of that group that were actually doing or prescribing some kind of Tibetan yoga as part of their healthcare practice. So that definitely was represented in this group. Um, so yeah.
The context of this section, what might you say about hybridity in terms of how practitioners approach their healing and clinical?
Yeah, so the last of the positionalities is kind of like um, I sort of struggled to find a name for this, and what I wound up just calling it was people who are eclectically mixing religion, spirituality, and healing. And what I mean by that is people who are sort of like combining multiple different threads together. So, Buddhism combined with like New Age, practices or crystal healing or um, you know, um, there was one practitioner who was Chinese American who was incorporating all sorts of different like Taoist and Chinese medicine and Buddhism all together. So this was the most diverse in terms of the practitioners because they're really, we're combining all sorts of different things from one another. So, but yet there's this underlying dynamic, right, where they are freely incorporating different kinds of practices and mixing them together, as opposed to, say, the Dharma teachers or the traditional medicine communities where there was a lot more focus. Maybe this is something interesting to get into, but each one of these groups had sort of like a unique focus in the way that were talking, what they were emphasizing about Buddhism and medicine. And so for the traditional medicine people, so the people who are combining Buddhism with traditional medicine, for them, they were by far they were the only group that really, really emphasized authenticity and formal textual training. So that was the group that was talking about the need for like intensive study of traditional medicine and really basing that on texts and basing that on tradition and having the importance of the lineage and so forth. Um, so that's kind of like maybe an anti-hybridity kind of standpoint in a certain respect. Even though they're combining Buddhism with traditional medicine, they still are sort of like having the idea that these are traditions that need to be preserved, that need to be that you need a lot of training to get into. And that's in contrast with this eclectic group, the last group, who were much more freely um, reaching for all kinds of different practices and mixing them together, sort of like irregardless of the lineage. Um, what mattered more for them, this was the only group, the eclectic group was the only group that really emphasized the kind of the charismatic or individual kind of power of the healer themselves, right? So like these healers were focused really on their on their abilities as individuals. They had special abilities. They had special access to special powers that enabled them to pull together all of these different practices. And so this is the only group that emphasized that. Um, then you have the first group that I talked about with the people who are incorporating Buddhism into a biomedical setting, and for them, they were really focused on just how simple Buddhist teachings are, right? In contrast to the other groups, their whole point was, you just need a tiny bit of Buddhism in the medical setting, right? Just a little bit of mindfulness or a little bit of kind of like peaceful, paying attention to your breath to have these huge health benefits, right? So they were kind of like focusing on the ease and simplicity with which Buddhism could be incorporated.
Two things that come to mind in the adoption of Buddhist medical ideas and practices is making it meaningful and efficacy, having it be effective in our lives. So just to bring back these strands of thought, we were talking about medical pluralism. For me, as a Chinese medicine practitioner, I think of biomedicine in a local context. I also think of classical medical pies or schools or streams. And as a practitioner, we bring these together. There's this other notion of integration and hybridity where we have this kind of braided knowledge, or we make meaning as a practitioner or clinician so that we're more effective and we can be more culturally competent and connect with others. Do you see these in your understanding of the global history of medicine? Are these common patterns? Or are we in a new era transnationally where the exchange of knowledge is changing what Buddhist practice is and what it amounts to in terms of healing?
Yeah, I I think it's kind of both. Right. We certainly, so for the first time, we are in a situation where you can literally access, every form of Buddhism that's ever existed, from your armchair, right? Like online. You can read about, the teachings, you can access books, by the millions, on, every aspect of Buddhism that you can imagine. And it's also so sort of like atomized, like all of the information has become so sort of like pixelated and kind of like um circulated in these nano-sized little bits that you have, like memes all over the internet, or you have like little like sayings or quotes that are circulating, whether or not the Dalai Lama actually said it, who cares? It's they're just all over the place, right? Of all these kinds of all of these different ideas related to Buddhism and health and Asian medicine and so forth, and they're all sort of I picture it just all kind of like these little pixels just all kind of circulating, around the world, and getting combined together in novel ways by people all over the world that have, access to this information, and all sorts of new combinations are being created constantly by by each individual person, right? So there's that's new. That certainly is a much more fluid um, kind of picture of cultural exchange than what I study happening in the medieval period with like a text that one pilgrim brought from India to China and then translated into Chinese, right? So there's it's a very different kind of like uh, environment for cross-cultural exchange, and the speed at which it happens and the sort of the scale on which it happens is completely different. But some of the dynamics are, I think, the same or quite similar as they always have been, which is that human beings in the face of a variety of different ideas circulating around through their worlds, human beings collect up those ideas into certain packages or certain kinds of like threads or certain kinds of units that they create mythologies and create social organizations and create boundaries around. And then they argue with each other over which ones of those are the authentic ones, which ones are the true ones, which ones are the real teachings. And then there's a social process whereby society determines, or different social groups determine which ones of those arguments are legitimate and which ones aren't, right? And so, like, it happens all the time that new configurations of things come together and they seem very different than what's happened before, but they become authorized by the society, and these new forms become major um, trends or major kinds of new novel constructions. Um, when we look at the past in history, we can see that happening, and we as historians will say, like, oh, look, this is the birth of Mahayana, right? Or this is the birth of Vajrayana, or this is the birth of, Chinese Buddhism, this new tradition, right? Um, but it's constantly happening today too, right? But we just don't have the hindsight to know which ones of these new configurations are going to be the ones that are going to be remembered 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now. Um, so often, the same scholars, same people who would readily recognize the processes that lead to the birth of, Mahayana in, the BC period in India, are the same people who are lamenting, the new constructions that are being done today, right? Even though the process is the same, right? So, as a scholar and not a member of a particular, Buddhist, I'm not Buddhist. I'm not affiliated with a particular group that I'm trying to defend against the others. It's easy for me to sort of like say something like that, right? Uh, but I'm well aware that different Buddhists are sort of like really dug in on different sectarian commitments and really believe that that is the only true authentic form of Buddhism, and that any kind of corruption of that is a degradation. Um, right? But as a scholar, like stepping back and looking, like all of these different sects all have that position, and they're all arguing against each other. And my job isn't to sort of determine which one is the authentic form of Buddhism. It's just to sort of like step back and look at the social dynamics that those kinds of debates produce, or the cultural effects that those kind of debates produce. So that's my job as a scholar, right? So maybe not sort of the most satisfactory answer for people who are interested in practice, because it doesn't really lead to a firm answer about practice. But I think it's a really interesting perspective, to sort of like balance out some of the concerns of scholars, to then also take this more sort of abstract, scholarly critical perspective, and sort of combine the two together and see where it washes out for individuals.
For our scholar practitioners, researchers, and students, why don't we then shift to pedagogy and this notion of metadisciplinarity? Can you tell us about these beautiful examples of artwork and what you were bringing to the table in terms of new methods of pedagogy, and learning in Buddhist studies. So, what is metadisciplinarity, and what are these beautiful pieces of artwork?
Yeah, yeah, thanks for that. Um, yeah, so I don't know exactly where to start with that. I think probably what I need to do is start with a just referring to a blog, a series that I wrote that sort of predated the publication of the academic the article about pedagogy. So I have a series of blogs, maybe written in like 2021 or so, where they're on my website, where what I'm talking, the series is called Meta Perspectives in Asian Medicine, and there's four installations to the series. And what I'm looking at there is the tensions between the way that different groups of people have approached Asian medicine. You have, kind of like what I was just alluding to a minute ago. You have sort of like a traditionalist perspective, and then you have a postmodern kind of like scholarly perspective, right? Those are the two I was just talking about, where the traditionalist is looking for like the authenticity of the lineage, and the postmodern scholar is sort of like deconstructing those social and cultural, um, the socially and culturally constructed nature of tradition. And then you have sort of people that are coming out of the biomedical or scientific background, where they're really looking to sort of like interpret and understand um, Buddhism and Asian medicine from that perspective. And so you have these three kinds of like players in the field, and each one of them has their own communities and their own discourses, and they're talking amongst themselves and not necessarily talking to the other groups, right? So practitioners have their communities, their Facebook groups, their Twitter feeds, their books that they read, and scholars have ours, and the biomedical researchers have theirs, and we don't necessarily talk enough, I think, where there's not really true kind of like cross fertilization across those categories. And so I sort of explore that in the blog. I guess the main point in the blog is just to say, the place I arrive at is to say that instead of trying to solve that problem by having one community's perspective win out over the others, we have to just settle into a place where we accept the differences that each group is approaching the topic through. Just accept the differences and take on the perspectives of other people, and like just hold them simultaneously instead of rejecting them outright. So can you be a scholar who actually like you know deconstructs Chinese medicine, let's say, but also can experience qi, right? And also can understand the biomedical um, research, right? Can you be a traditional acupuncturist who believes in the power of acupuncture, but also understands and takes on the academic critique of the constructed nature of tradition, and also understand the biomedicine without reducing it down to one, which is what happens. So lots of people do what they think is interdisciplinary work, where they're like, "Oh, I'm an acupuncturist, and I read all the scholarship and I understand the biomedical research," but in their minds, they're reducing the other perspectives down to their perspective, right? So what I'm saying in the blog is like, can you hold multiple divergent epistemologies at the same time without reducing one to all of them to one? So from that standpoint, then you come to this article. So in this article, what I'm talking about is how like that plays out on a college campus with a series of kind of collaborations that I experimented with over the years, bringing together different disciplines together um, to talk about some of these topics. And what I realized was that if we're going to come together as an interdisciplinary team around a topic, if we're just going to argue about whose perspective is right, right? If that's what we're doing, or reducing all of the arguments down to just my perspective, right? We're not actually doing interdisciplinary work. So I'm kind of what I'm arguing is for a different approach where we allow each one of the disciplines to have their own domain in the way that they study the topic, and allow these perspectives to appear kind of like sequentially in a course. Like, okay, here's the biomedical, here's the traditional, here's the historical, here's the sociological, here's the ethnographic, etc. And no, rather than attempting to reduce them to one another, have them stand as different epistemological approaches of equal status in the class, um, and focus our conversation on what I call metadisciplinarity. So when the professors are speaking, rather than trying to just like convince people of the rightness of my disciplinary perspective on this, instead to speak about in metadisciplinary terms, it would be talking about here are the things that my discipline bring to light about this subject. Here are the new perspectives that my discipline bring forth about this subject, and adding them like onto the table, alongside when the biomedical professor gets up and talks about, the science of mindfulness or whatever, that those are added to the table. And then the artist gets up and talks about, the expressiveness of how these ideas make them feel, and how these ideas, they want to express them in art. Those are added to the table, and it becomes like you know, a buffet of all sorts of different approaches that we can enjoy equally, instead of like this impulse that scholars have to reduce everybody else's perspective down to my discipline. That maybe that was too long of an explanation, but that's what's going on in this article.
Oh, wonderful. It really gives an understanding of inroads to how Buddhist studies can shift our way of studying subjects or approaching healing. Um, any last thoughts that you wanted to share in terms of the landscape of contemporary healing in Buddhist medicine? Or uh, again, anything great on your desk that you're enjoying these days in terms of academic writing?
Yeah, I guess I would just say on the topic of this article, before leaving it behind, is just like one of the things that writing this article I was trying to get across is really like Buddhist studies can really be at the center of this kind of metadisciplinary collaboration, because Buddhist studies, and I give two examples of how that has happened on my campus, how Buddhist studies has been sort of the focal point for these kinds of interdisciplinary explorations. And I think there's a lot of reasons why, but one of them certainly is the that this metadisciplinarity idea of like holding multiple paradigms simultaneously and talking about the advantages and disadvantages of them, as opposed to trying to like narrow them all down to one perspective, like that is kind of quite similar to a Buddhist perspective on emptiness and skillful means, right? Like no one perspective is the ultimate perspective, and let's analyze how using these different perspectives illuminates or elucidates different aspects, for the benefit of the whole, right? So, yeah, so some of the methodology that I bring forward in my work, I think we might have touched on this last time too, just about like multiplicity of paradigms, and how Buddhist medicine really holds those simultaneously. So a lot of the methodologies that I bring forward in my academic work, I don't say it like this, but they're influenced very heavily by Buddhist ideas. And so this is just another example of that kind of phenomenon in my own work. Um, yeah, and in terms of like, I guess other things to say, like future projects and so on and so forth, like this yet again, because it's always a theme in my work. This theme of multiple angles on the same problem and not resolving them all down to one, but kind of like holding them simultaneously and looking at this topic from different, through different um, angles and perspectives is again um, my focus as I'm moving forward in my new research project, which is this study of the meditation sickness or wind illnesses or the dangers of spiritual practice more generally, meditation in particular. Um, Looking at that question historically, ethnographically, biomedically, scientifically, from inside the traditions, right? As well, and sort of like having all of those perspectives kind of like at the table, having a conversation together, as opposed to reductively boiling down the problem to one perspective or another.
And what do we have on the desk that's been really fun reading for you, or something you'd like to for more people to contact? Any new academic works or projects?
I'm kind of, at the moment I'm kind of up to my elbows in meditation sickness. So this is kind of my yeah, it's kind of what I've been sort of like completely immersed in for the last several months. So, reading around that topic and preparing this book that I think we talked about last time, that I'm preparing with translations from scholars from across the gamut, Buddhist studies specialists and some Asian medicine practitioners that are talking about approaches to meditation sickness. And yeah, this has been a really interesting kind of topic for leading me into different areas that I'm not familiar with, different sort of like bodies of scholarship that I haven't sort of encountered before. And so I have been reading, I've been reading some stuff from the field of psychology that it's not an area that I really have looked into before. I've been reading the sort of the medical studies on um, side effects of meditation and so forth that have come out, which is a whole sort of different kind of genre of literature. And one area that I'm sort of intrigued by, that I'm getting into right now, is the whole sort of subsection of the academic world that's known as MAD studies. So MAD studies is the study of extreme mental states, extreme kinds of what might be called psychosis, that is normally thought of as a mental health crisis, and treated as such by psychiatry. But MAD studies is a field of the academy that is really sort of like centering the experiences of the non-ordinary, the extraordinary experiences of people, and using that to kind of challenge the mainstream um, norms about what what reality is like is, and what mental health looks like. And there's an obvious tie-in with this meditation sickness stuff that is kind of my entree into that. But I'm discovering that there are these pockets of scholarship out there that I wasn't aware of, that are actually very much kind of like on the same page about multiple epistemologies, and not having one be predominant, but coming at that from a radically different angle than I've ever sort of considered myself. And so yeah, so I'm enjoying sort of the discovery of these new areas. Mysticism studies is another one that I've just gotten into, where yeah, where um, scholars are not operating with the assumption that reality is the same as mainstream reality. So it's kind of fun to enter into these new areas.
Eagerly anticipated research, and we look forward to hearing about the progress and publication. And I hope there's something we'll learn through ethnographic research for positive and adverse or negative appraisals of meditation experience from diverse communities or practitioners. Maybe there's a scholar or a research
Yeah.
and do some qualitative research.
Yeah. So this volume that I'm putting together, I have now 22 submissions from scholars, and half of them are historical. So they are, some of them are scriptural texts. So they're from Pali, from Chinese, from Sanskrit. There's Tibetan commentaries, Chinese commentaries, Japanese as well. So there's historical materials, but then half of the volume is ethnographic. So looking at how do practitioners, teachers, Dharma teachers, and also Asian medicine practitioners, how do they interpret, um, diagnose, um, understand the origins, and prevent and treat so the side
Mhm.
effects of spiritual practice, or wind illness, or meditation sickness, or what have you. In different cultures, they call it different things. So yeah, so there's a ton of material that's coming forward through this project from all over Asia. Like, I've been very exhaustive in trying to get, as many Asian cultures and traditions of Buddhism represented in the volume as I possibly can. And so the volume is yeah, hopefully going to be out in I'd like to say by the end of the year, but it's probably going to be 2025. Just the pace that scholarly publication works, but yeah, but I have the materials, and it's really exciting stuff. So yeah, maybe have me back on. We can talk about that in more detail.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Pierce. I hope we can do a follow-up on this body of research. And we really didn't scratch the surface in terms of the second volume on modern and contemporary sources. So hopefully we can meet again soon.
Yeah,
And
let's do it.
so much for taking this time.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, James. Appreciate it.